Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Great, very good. So sorry not to be there. I actually spent 6 years in Tallahassee teaching it across the way at FSU, so I sort of missed the place. But thanks for coming to hear my talk for a few minutes on successful resilience programs, or how to promote successful resilience programs, particularly in coastal domains, more specifically in New York and New Jersey. I just want to briefly sort of introduce you a little bit to the RESA program, which this work is part of. It's a sort of NOAA-funded effort. These are sort of described as integrated regional science and assessments across sort of large swaths of geographies in the U.S. So I'm connected with one that focuses on the Northeast, particularly from areas of northern Delaware up through Massachusetts. So what I want to do is sort of talk about the issue of climate adaptation. I think one of the things that we sort of recognize is that climate adaptation as a process is sort of accelerating across a range of different domains. That there's a lot of literature about how to make it more effective and what are some of the opportunities to enhance success. There's a lot of discussion about the enabling conditions. What are things that are necessary and appropriate to foster adaptation? We've already heard some great examples of cutting edge knowledge is critical, but there's a whole range of other things that people talk about as well. There's a lot of debate about what are metrics for effectiveness and success and how to communicate those. How do we, and then kind of connected to that, item 4 here is how to measure them, how to evaluate them, how to report, progress toward some of these sustainability goals. And sort of a larger question, item 3 here, is the idea that resiliency efforts and adaptation efforts sort of interconnect with a large set of community questions, particularly quality of life. So how to make it so that adaptation or resiliency not only is sort of addressing the particular climate risk question, but also sort of connecting to other needs and interests of the communities at hand. Let's see. Sorry, unfortunately, occasionally it gets stuck a little bit. So in terms of some of the other issues that are emerging, it is this sort of crucial question of like, how does try to understand how adaptation, resiliency efforts connect to these sort of quality of lives. What sorts of theoretical frames can we use? There's a lot of really interesting social science work that's being brought to bear here to sort of understand like how and why different communities are taking up information or rejecting it, or sort of connecting their perceptions and underlying beliefs with some of the actions that they might take vis-a-vis climate change, and sort of uptaking the kinds of new initiatives that are being fostered very much so at the local level. And so this notion of how do you connect the risk perception, the risk-taking behavior, some of the social structures or sort of power relations that we see in communities, who they trust and who they don't, and how that sort of translates into what we might describe as more effective resiliency process. So what we tried to do for this work is to sort of develop a mechanism to sort of connect with the NOAA goals of really engaging with some of the stakeholders and policymakers, but at the same time sort of work with the households and businesses in some of these sites and sort of understand what are these sort of intersecting interests of both the practitioners and the household members and business stakeholders, with respect to emerging climate risk and resiliency efforts. So what we did is we sort of put forward a kind of a process to sort of do a couple of practitioner workshops, one out on Long Island of New York and one in coastal New Jersey. And that from that, we developed a survey instrument. So sort of directly feeding off the process that was brought forward from the workshops, conducted some surveys, and now we're in the process of sort of getting some really interesting results back. And we're going to feed that back into the policymakers to sort of give them a better understanding of like what's working in the community, what's not, and what are some of the reasons why that might not be working. So most fundamentally, we want to kind of define and evaluate some of those emerging and data needs. So that's sort of like the essence of what the workshop was looking at, again, particularly in the kind of the flooding domain. Obviously, this is an area hit by Hurricane Sandy 10 years back, but there have been many other sort of climate risk issues that are emerging, as well as sunny day flooding, nuisance flooding, and other sort of large-scale heavy downpour events, which have sort of influenced the thinking of residents. So the two workshops produced really important results in terms of what kinds of things the stakeholders and practitioners who were developing the policies, what they were trying to achieve, and what kinds of information did they still feel was needed to fully understand how to enhance the effectiveness. And again, their understanding of what were metrics or proper metrics of effectiveness were still kind of in development. So we're sort of at the beginning stages of a lot of this sort of initiative. So we as we said, we kind of took this information and brought forward a household survey focused on decision making, and a lot of the rest of the presentation will sort of focus on some of the results that have come out so far, and what the implications might be. Now, there's a couple of things to think about here. One, there's this sort of larger kind of theoretical question about the connection between risk perception, risk behavior, and how that might be influenced by their experience from climate events, length of residency, socioeconomic status, and a range of other kind of similar variables, but also more importantly, how are they taking up some of the information with respect to some of these resiliency programs, and what are they doing with it, and what might that sort of, how that information might influence their future decision making with respect to residency and or sort of engaging with some of these basic resiliency efforts that are being planned locally. So we wanted to look at a set of different communities, and we chose 6 locations across the New York, New Jersey area. We explicitly did not include the city of New York. There's been a fair bit of work on that site, and we wanted to sort of move out across the different suburban ranges that extend from the city. Speak a little bit more about this in a moment. We wanted to sort of particularly focus on those areas that had been impacted by Sandy, where the flooding had taken place. So there was this sort of sense of past history, at least with respect to flooding, and also looking at the FEMA 1% flood zone. Basically, I'm getting an echo. I apologize. Nothing. Are you guys getting an echo?
No, you're here.
Okay, hopefully that'll go away. It seems like it's moderated. There was a really interest, both in the literature and also from the practitioners, like trying to understand what different types of communities might be responding, whether or not they're older suburbs, sort of slightly higher density suburbs, more contemporary, sort of like some cases post-World War II suburbs, and then those further out, both on Long Island and further south on the Jersey Shore, that would be defined as sort of exurban and have a highly vacation-oriented domain associated with them. So I'm just going to toggle through very quickly through the different sites. So we did pairings of 2 of each, 2 inner suburbs, 2 outer suburbs, 2 exurban and sort of vacation sites. As I go through, you can see some of the different densities. 15,000 people per square mile as example. This is Long Beach, just outside the city of New York, as well as some of the variations in household income to get a little bit of a snapshot. I will say the median household income masks the fact that as you move toward the shore in most of these locations, the residents are typically wealthier because it's more valuable real estate, and 2, in some cases, they're only temporary or summer residents, so they might not be captured in these census data. So that's a significant caveat to think about. But just to give you a sense of what we're looking at. So this is Long Beach, Keansburg, coastal New Jersey. That's sort of the inner suburb. The outer suburb, we have Amityville. Again, the densities are going down. The areas that I've highlighted here are the ones where we did the survey work. Monmouth Beach in New Jersey, slightly further down the coast. Again, lower densities. And then further out, West Hampton Beach, this income of 105 is probably significantly lower than what it actually is, in some of these coastal residences. And then further down on the Jersey Shore, we have Point Pleasant Beach. So one of the huge issues with this work was COVID in terms of how this work was done. We actually started it just pre-COVID, and basically that changed everything. It changed our research design. It changed how we're going to gather data. It changed our IRB, which you need when you're interacting with responses. And also, we then sort of wanted to look at, a stratified sample in each one of these locations. We distributed about 1,000 surveys per site. We got about 25% response rates, which is fair, which is actually not bad for these sites and for a lot of reasons. And there's some other details I could give you in terms of the sampling process and methodology if interested. So let me just sort of jump into some of the surveys, because I think it sort of illustrates some of these points that I kind of highlighted at the beginning. What are some of these connections and what might be some of the trends that we might want to think about? Again, the overarching question is, how does this influence the success or the effectiveness of some of the programs that are being considered? So I'll just sort of toggle through some of these questions. So one of the questions, how much, and I should say this is about 180 responses. We have another 2 communities yet that we haven't been able to sort of fully integrate. The full sample is about 240 or so. So how much has your flood risk changed in the past 10 years? So you can see, even sort of, without really thinking into the future, that this is something that's, of people's minds, considerable more risk and then slightly less risk. This broader territory is not much, right? So, but again, we see that, somewhere over 40% are already thinking that there's been some change in risk already affecting. If we look into the future, how much will it affect you in the future? Basically 2/3 of the residents that we've surveyed are saying that this is going to be something that's going to be important to my property. If we want to look at what is their concern, what are the big issues? Obviously, much of them, the big blue band is coastal flooding. Some of them are concerned about everything. The issue of sunny day flooding is still relatively minor, but we see it really increasing in some communities as well. Only 2%, have no concerns about risk associated with flooding. So now we want to look at a little bit how much are they engaging in some of the efforts. And I should say that in both of these cases, I didn't really highlight that. There's a lot of work going on at the local level, both at the county, state, and in some cases the municipal level. So we look at this example. Which of the following best describes your understanding of the current emergency flood evacuation warning systems and protocols? That's a real basic one, right? And overall, only about a fifth of the respondents sort of knew about them and were ready to go, right? They knew everything about what was going on. So that's gives you a sense of there isn't a lot of sort of uptake in a lot of these cases. So even that particular case was sort of interesting, that vast majority don't know that much about what's going on. And some don't even know, we're not even aware of them, or we're aware but don't know any details. And then this one sort of looks at which of the following government activities have you participated in, and what degree did you find them useful? So if you sort of toggle from the left to the right in this screen, if you look at was not aware of the activity, was very unhelpful, was unhelpful, you can see the color bands, the blue, the oranges. Hopefully you can see those are the same colors, blue, orange, and yellow sort of extending. So in most cases, these things, and they range from trainings to open houses, phone alerts, et cetera, we're not having a lot of touchdown. Workshop and conferences, that seemed to be the one that, people were attending, they found useful, but most of this other stuff, they just weren't engaging with it. And then, which of the following factors influence your ability to engage with government initiated flood resiliency programs, and to what degree? So this is really kind of looking at what are some of the barriers, which are barriers. So the blue are illustrating that these weren't really barriers. So, the cost, for example, this case, about 38% of the people said, the cost wasn't an issue. But you can see overall that each one of these kind of barriers came up pretty significantly. They're very, not so much frequently very important, but certainly important or moderately important in terms of the degree that they were going to able to engage. So these are sort of, clear illustrations of barriers or limits to people's engagement. Then the other question was, what is your opinion about the usefulness of these programs? And this is really a kind of an interesting case, because we hear a lot about insurance as being a useful mechanism, or encouraging emergency management, et cetera. But really, in terms of what they thought was going to be most effective, was encouraging hazard protection construction and building, which has gone on very much intensely since Hurricane Sandy. And we can see, over 70% thinking that. But the other thing that was kind of interesting is that we have a large percentage that feel like encouraging people to move away from high-risk areas, which is sort of somewhat counterintuitive because most people don't want to be told to leave their area. But they also said that, if other people are encouraged, that might be a good thing. So that was sort of an interesting result. And then here's another question. To what extent do you feel the information provided by the current flood risk resiliency programs influence your decision? So this is really getting to that larger question. How much is it really influencing? And of course, with any survey, there's always these interactions. Some of these questions are designed to sort of interact, to look at issues from multiple perspectives. So in this case, only 10% knew about them and influenced and felt like they influenced them a lot, right? So in most cases, there's like limited effectiveness. And in this case, the blue band here didn't know about them and did not influence my thinking, 40%. And then another quarter knew about them, but didn't influence me very much at all, right? So again, there's a lot of focus by these stakeholders trying to promote resilience, particularly post-Sandy, and very little uptake, or moderate uptake at best. Okay, so which entity is taking the lead, and who do you trust? This is a really critical question in terms of this process. In general, the federal government, things like NOAA, FEMA, et cetera, were seen as like the most active, as well as the local government. They really knew very little about what was going on at the county level, at the state level. Again, this is New York and New Jersey and the various counties in which they're located. Very little on like local NGOs and all the sort of the public sector or sort of civil society issues didn't really come up very strongly at all. And this is the one most likely trust or engage with. Again, sort of similar result here. The feds and local government were seen as really, the most trustworthy, the most sort of like, we want to work with you guys. Everyone else was sort of rather minimal. Interestingly, the private sector was like the least trusted and least wanted to engage, which came out to be an interesting result. So I'll just sort of end off with a couple of other slides that talk about like what factors might influence you sort of moving forward to sort of engage more in some of these programs that are being developed. And then this one is the idea of like, well, if your property is getting slammed, then you might want to engage more. So this is a question: how do you feel your coastal flood risk has affected your property value currently? So in this case, it's like mostly no noticeable effect that's that big. This is actually the actual number of respondents that we have in this particular question. In some cases, already currently, basically almost a little more than a third feel that there has been some decrease, either significant or moderate, in their value. In some cases, people say more, which is sort of interesting, but about a third are already saying this. And then if we look into the future, to what degree do you feel your home is protected against flood risk between now and the year 2050, which is one of these sort of metrics that people talk about for some of these floods increased scenarios. Only 10% felt that their home was protected, very well protected. Again, the vast majority felt otherwise. Some felt somewhat protected. A lot had no idea or were uncertain. And then again, about a third basically said somewhat at risk and very much at risk, almost 20%. And then kind of ending off here with some other issues. How would you best describe your opinion regarding the next 30 years? And then, flood hazards will remain the same and there'll be no obvious impact on my property value. So again, a small minority of those folks felt that was going to be the case. The vast majority felt that, and this is sort of the interesting point, that the flood risk will increase, but current and planned resiliency efforts will help protect my property, right? So that's a critical statement there, about a third. But the largest percentage felt like these programs, the flood hazard will increase, but these programs will not have any ability to protect my property, which again gives that sense of failure, and then sort of why engage if that's the case. And then the other question, of course, that people ask is like, when might people move? When might people sort of disengage and sort of relocate? And so, how many Sandy level events? And again, this was sort of the current storm of record. It was a significant flooding event, not a major wind event, not a major rain event, but a significant flooding event. And so we asked a series of metrics. I'm already planning to move. So 4% of people said that I'm out of here already. Another storm like Sandy in the next 5 years will get me to seriously consider moving. So we can see that, not half, but about almost half, 44% fell into that category. That, Sandy was an event, and that it might precipitate further movement. And then we go down, to this. About a third of the people are like, we're staying here no matter what. Like, I don't know what will take me to move, but it'll be at least be more than 2 Sandy type storms in the next decade. Right, so they're in it for the long haul. So again, really interesting differences in the population. We're just starting to look at some of those. Oops, I think some of the differences between populations. So this is just as one fun example. So those who median family income is more than 150K. That's those some of those residents, particularly out on the east end of Long Island. They're much less likely to sort of move with a Hurricane Sandy type event. But if you make less than that 150K, which is still a big number throughout much of the country, but less so in the New York metro region, if you make lower amounts, you're more likely to move. So that kind of illustrates some of those variances that we're expecting to see with respect to income levels, with the face of future risk. So just to sort of end off with, and again, this is sort of, we're kind of at the beginnings of some of these data analysis. We have 2 more municipalities to bring in. We want to look at these cross comparisons, but I think the results themselves show obviously a lot of variation, but illustrate some of the constraints that a lot of these practitioners have with respect to getting their messaging out. Understanding of local resiliency programs is quite limited, across the board for most of the residents. There's the perception of risk for future risk and attachment to place, is pretty strong and remains consistent. The vast majority felt that risk was going to increase in the future. A subset we're kind of ready to go. Like almost a half of them were ready to go with the next big storm, which affects real estate issues and sort of market values, while another third or so we're going to stay no matter what. So that's kind of an interesting issue in terms of what that might mean in terms of coastal development. And then it's sort of, we look at some of these larger questions then about how then to adjust, take these results and sort of feed them back into sort of communication, risk communication efforts that these local communities and counties, in these 2 states are developing. So that's sort of part of the process. We're also in the process of doing some, specific follow-up interviews with some of the respondents, and we're also going to do some targeted business interviews, as well as some, as I said, some basic statistical work to look at the comparisons of different cohorts, in the sample. And I want to thank you. That's what I'd like to present, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? Yeah.
Could you just elaborate a little bit on those demographics of the survey
Yeah, so the question was to elaborate on the socio-demographics of survey respondents.
Yes. Okay. So, well, what we have is the data for the municipalities. We already know. Overall, the respondents were. We asked a series of socioeconomic questions. Of course, you have to sort of, it's a sort of length of residency issues, income levels. Those are sort of the, I'm trying to think of, well, income levels, and sort of whether or not they're homeowners or renters. We haven't yet looked at how those. Oops, I'm getting some echoing, but how those factors sort of played into differential responses. But those are the data that we have available.
Any other questions? I'm curious. Who are the practitioners that you mentioned? Kind of people or roles were they?
Wow. I'm really sorry. Is there any way to put the question in the chat? I'm hearing, if that was a question, I really apologize. Okay, very good. Thank you. So this was mostly, I mean, one of the crucial thing here, of course, doing this kind of work is to sort of, foster and develop connections over the long term. So I'm with the City University of New York. I know some of the folks out on Long Island. I know some of the folks in Jersey, but I work closely with some of my colleagues, both at Stony Brook University at Stony Brook, and then also Monmouth University in New Jersey. And so they brought together sort of their Rolodex, so to speak. So it was municipal. It was, for the most part, it was municipal representatives, township representatives in each location, as well as county officials. There were a couple of NGO that sort of operate, broadly, in the region, focused on resilience. There were one or two. Each workshop had about 25 to 30 stakeholders. There were also a few people from the state of New Jersey and the state of New York. I'm trying to remember now if there were any feds there, but I don't believe that there were feds. It was mostly, the ambition was really to connect with local practitioners who were developing, local programming. So that was sort of how we kind of set up the workshop. Thank you. Good question.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? So if not, we'll end the session here. Thank you very much, Phil.
Thank you.